abdomen, a sensation that seemed to pulse gently with its own rhythm. It wasn't painful or uncomfortable, but it was definitely noticeable, as if some kind of healing or transformation was taking place at a cellular level. The prophetess's prayer became more specific, addressing what seemed to be detailed knowledge of Grace's medical history and emotional journey. She spoke about years of disappointment being transformed into testimony, about a pregnancy that would be so healthy and trouble-free that it would undo all the trauma of previous failures, about a child who would be worth every moment of the long wait. "I see twins," Prophetess Deborah declared suddenly, her voice taking on a prophetic tone that caused several people nearby to gasp with excitement. "Two healthy babies, a boy and a girl, born at full term without complications. These children will be signs and wonders, proof of God's faithfulness to those who wait on Him." Grace felt her knees weaken at these words, and she might have fallen if the prophetess hadn't been supporting her with steady hands. The specificity of the prophecy was overwhelming, not just pregnancy, but twins, not just children, but specific genders, not just conception, but a promise of healthy full-term delivery. It was more than Grace had ever dared to hope for, even in her most optimistic moments. The prayer concluded with Prophetess Deborah pressing a small object into Grace's palm, a beautiful hand mirror with an intricate snake design carved around its frame. The mirror itself was polished to perfect clarity, and the carved details seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. "This is a mirror of manifestation," the prophetess explained quietly, speaking directly into Grace's ear so that only she could hear. "Look into it each morning and evening, and speak words of faith over your body. See yourself as already pregnant, already carrying the children God has promised you. This mirror has been blessed and prayed over. It will serve as a point of contact for your faith during the weeks ahead." Grace clutched the mirror tightly, feeling its smooth weight in her palm like a tangible piece of the miracle she had just received. The carving around the frame was incredibly detailed, with the snake design seeming to move and shift when she looked at it from different angles. Despite finding snakes generally frightening, something about this particular carving felt protective rather than threatening, as if it represented wisdom and transformation rather than danger. As Grace made her way back to her seat, she felt fundamentally different from the woman who had walked forward just minutes earlier. The chronic sadness that had been her constant companion for 14 years had been replaced by an unshakable certainty that her life was about to change dramatically. She moved through the crowd of other women with a lightness in her step that she hadn't felt in years. Connell took one look at her face when she returned and immediately understood that something significant had happened. Without saying a word, he wrapped his arms around her, and Grace buried her face in his shoulder, finally allowing herself to release the emotions that had been building throughout the entire experience. "She knew," Grace whispered against his ear, her voice shaking with wonder. "She knew exactly how long we've been trying. She said our waiting is over, Connell. She said we're going to have twins. A boy and a girl." Connell pulled back to look at her face, searching her expression for any sign of the guarded hope that had characterized their previous attempts to find answers. But what he saw instead was something he hadn't seen in his wife's eyes for years: complete, unreserved joy and expectation. The service continued with more testimonies and additional prayer for other needs, but Grace found it difficult to focus on anything except the warmth that continued to pulse gently in her abdomen and the weight of the mirror in her purse. She kept touching the small bag where she had placed it, reassuring herself that the entire experience had been real and not just an emotional reaction to a powerful church service. During the drive home, Grace and Connell talked almost nonstop about what had happened, analyzing every detail of the prophetess's prayer and trying to process the magnitude of the prophecy they had received. Grace shared the specific words that had been spoken over her, the physical sensations she had experienced, and the overwhelming sense of certainty that had settled into her heart. "I've never felt anything like it," Grace explained, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her stomach. "It wasn't just emotional, it was physical. I could feel something changing inside my body, something real and tangible. And the way she knew about the 14 years, Connell, there's no way she could have known that unless God revealed it to her." Connell listened with a mixture of excitement and protective concern. He wanted to believe as completely as Grace did, but part of him was already bracing for potential disappointment. They had been hurt too many times before to fully abandon caution, even in the face of such a powerful experience. "I believe something significant happened today," he said carefully, choosing his words to be supportive without raising expectations too high. "The prophetess certainly seemed to have supernatural insight, and I could see the change in you immediately after the prayer. But Grace, I need you to promise me that if the pregnancy doesn't happen as quickly as we hope, you won't interpret that as a failure of faith or a sign that God has rejected you." Grace nodded, understanding his concern but feeling confident that such precautions wouldn't be necessary. The certainty she felt was unlike anything she had ever experienced, deeper than emotion and more solid than wishful thinking. She knew, with a knowledge that seemed to bypass her rational mind entirely, that she was going to become pregnant very soon. That night, Grace used the mirror for the first time, following the prophetess's instructions to look into it while speaking words of faith over her body. The reflection that looked back at her seemed different somehow, more radiant, more hopeful, more alive with possibility. As she spoke words of expectation and gratitude, she continued to feel the gentle warmth in her abdomen that had first appeared during the prayer service. The snake carving around the mirror's frame seemed particularly beautiful in the soft light of their bedroom. Grace found herself tracing the intricate details with her finger, admiring the craftsmanship, and the way the design seemed to flow seamlessly around the entire circumference. The snake appeared to be swallowing its own tail, creating a perfect circle that represented eternity, completion, and the fulfillment of promises. Over the following days, Grace established a routine of using the mirror twice daily, always at the same times, always with the same words of faith and expectation. She would speak to her reflection about the twins that were coming, visualizing herself with a rounded belly, imagining the joy of feeling their first movements, planning for their arrival as if it were an established fact rather than a hoped-for possibility. The physical sensations that had begun during the prayer service continued and even intensified. Grace experienced waves of nausea that seemed too purposeful to be random illness, unusual fatigue that felt different from normal tiredness, and changes in her appetite that reminded her of the early pregnancy symptoms she had read about so many times over the years. But it was the dreams that provided the most compelling evidence that something supernatural was happening. Night after night, Grace experienced vivid dreams involving water and serpents, but unlike the nightmare such imagery might normally produce, these dreams felt prophetic and encouraging. She would dream of swimming in crystal-clear pools while beautiful snakes swam alongside her, their scales catching the light like jewels. She would dream of rain falling on dry ground, causing immediate growth and flowering in places that had been barren for years. In one particularly vivid dream, Grace found herself standing beside a large body of water that reflected the sky so perfectly it was impossible to tell where the water ended and the heavens began. A magnificent serpent with scales that seemed to contain all the colors of the rainbow emerged from the water and spoke to her in a voice that was both ancient and familiar. "Your time of waiting is finished," the serpent said, its voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. "What was closed will be opened, what was empty will be filled, what was impossible will become inevitable. The children you carry will be signs to this generation of my power to create life where there was no life." Grace woke from this dream with tears of joy streaming down her face and an even stronger conviction that her pregnancy was not just possible but already in progress. The dream had felt more real than most of her waking experiences, and she carried its message with her throughout the following days like a precious secret that filled her with continuous hope. 3 weeks after the service at the Sanctuary of the Living Mantle, Grace woke up feeling distinctly different. The nausea that had been coming and going was now constant and unmistakable, and she felt a tenderness in her breasts that she had learned to recognize as a potential sign of pregnancy. But more than the physical symptoms, she felt a deep inner knowing that the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. She took a home pregnancy test with hands that shook from excitement rather than nervousness, and when 2 clear lines appeared in the result window, Grace sank to her knees in their bathroom and wept with gratitude. After 14 years of negative tests, false hopes, and crushing disappointments, she was finally, genuinely pregnant. Connell found her there a few minutes later, still crying and holding the positive test like a precious treasure. He knelt beside her on the bathroom floor, and they held each other while the reality of their miracle slowly sank in. The prophecy was coming to pass exactly as prophetess Deborah had declared, and their lives were about to be transformed in ways they had hardly dared to imagine. The doctor's appointment a few days later confirmed what Grace already knew in her heart. Not only was she pregnant, but the ultrasound revealed exactly what the prophetess had prophesied. She was carrying twins, one boy and one girl, both developing perfectly and measuring exactly right for their gestational age. Grace left the medical office with ultrasound photos clutched in her hand and a heart so full of joy she thought it might burst. Everything the prophetess had spoken was coming to pass with remarkable precision, and Grace felt like she was living inside a miracle that would transform not just her own life, but serve as a testimony to everyone who had witnessed her years of waiting and hoping. The news of Grace's miraculous pregnancy spread through their community like wildfire. Friends who had watched her struggle for 14 years were amazed by the sudden turn of events, and many wanted to know exactly what had happened at the sanctuary of the living mantle. Grace found herself sharing her testimony repeatedly, each time marveling at how perfectly everything had unfolded according to Prophetess Deborah's prophecy. Grace's sister Goy, however, was less enthusiastic about the supernatural explanation for the pregnancy. As a registered nurse with 15 years of experience in maternal health, Goy approached the situation with professional skepticism and growing concern about some of the details Grace shared about her experience at the church. "I'm thrilled that you're finally pregnant," Goy said during one of their phone conversations, her voice carefully controlled. "But Grace, some of the things you're telling me are making me worried. This mirror you're using, these dreams about snakes, it doesn't sound like normal spiritual practice to me." Grace bristled at her sister's implications. After years of medical failures and disappointments, she had finally found the answer through faith, and now Goy was trying to undermine her confidence with scientific skepticism. The mirror had become precious to Grace, a tangible connection to the miracle growing inside her body, and she used it religiously twice each day, speaking words of blessing over her developing babies. "You weren't there, Goy," Grace replied, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "You didn't feel what I felt, didn't hear the prophecy, didn't experience the power of God moving through that service. I know this seems unusual to you, but some things can't be explained by medical textbooks." The tension between the sisters grew as Grace's pregnancy progressed. Goy repeatedly asked Grace to schedule comprehensive prenatal care, to undergo the standard battery of tests and screenings that would ensure the health of both mother and babies. But Grace felt strongly that excessive medical intervention might somehow interfere with the supernatural nature of her pregnancy. "God didn't give me these babies so that doctors could poke and prod and worry about every little detail," Grace explained during one particularly heated conversation. "The prophetess said they would be born healthy at full term, and I believe that completely. Too much medical testing shows a lack of faith in God's promises." Goy found this reasoning deeply troubling, especially when Grace mentioned that other women from the church had given similar testimonies about avoiding medical care during their miracle pregnancies. As a healthcare professional, Goy knew that prenatal care was essential for identifying potential complications before they became dangerous, regardless of how the pregnancy had been conceived. What worried Goy even more were the changes she noticed in Grace's personality and behavior. Her sister, who had always been gentle and reasonable, was becoming increasingly secretive and defensive about anything related to her pregnancy or the church. Grace would spend hours each day in what she called prayer and meditation, but she would become upset if anyone interrupted or asked questions about these activities. The dreams that Grace described were also troubling to Goy. While Grace interpreted the water and snake imagery as positive spiritual symbols, Goy's nursing training had exposed her to enough unusual cases to recognize potential warning signs of psychological or spiritual manipulation. The level of detail in Grace's dreams, and the way they seemed to be directing her behavior, suggested something more complex than normal pregnancy-related changes. Goy's concerns deepened when she learned that Grace had been attending additional services at the Sanctuary of the Living Mantle, traveling the 2-hour distance every few weeks to receive continued ministry from Prophetess Deborah. Grace would return from these visits even more convinced of the supernatural nature of her pregnancy and even more resistant to medical oversight. The prophetess says that doubt and fear can affect the spiritual atmosphere around the babies, Grace explained after one such visit. She's been teaching me how to maintain pure faith and protect the miracle from negative influences. That's why I can't be around people who are speaking doubt over my situation.